To everybody for being here tonight. I will turn it over to Mari and the George Express to open us up this evening.
Perfect. So in addition to all of the music these children are learning, we're taking a little bit of Spanish 101. So see if you can figure out what this song might be about. You guys have to enunciate consonants.
Good enough to guess what the song is?
They want to go somewhere quickly.
We'll give you a clue. Mary's going to want it sung to the baby Jesus.
There we go.
December 17th.
So the first word was duerme, so it's sleep. There's a lullaby in Spanish. All right, so let us pray. Living God, in whom we live and move and have our being, all that we are, have been, and shall be is known to you. In the very secret of our hearts, you know all that rises to trouble us. Living flame, burn into us. Cleansing wind, blow through us. Fountain of water, well up within us, that we may love and praise in deed and in truth. Amen. Now the words that Jesus handed down to his disciples have been handed down to us through the ages. Let us pray.
Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial, and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and
Thank you to the George Express. Thank you to the children's program kids. And everybody has a good evening. There are a couple of other chairs, so if you're happy being in the back row, that's perfect. If you wanted to move, there's a couple more. So, Martha is in Aurora this evening, so she sends her regrets. She'd probably rather be here, but it's also it's at a meeting, I believe, for the water project that she's involved in. So while she's doing that, we are continuing with week 5 in the history of this place, and we have reached boom times. So, first question: who is the first minister or priest or pastor or somebody, a significant person from your religious experience that you remember in your life?
It was the camp chaplain who was retired Anglican priest, and we helped him Padre, and his wife was Grandma. And yeah, he just touched me very deeply, and I was able to stay in touch and visit him after camp, which yeah, it was lovely.
I'll go last. Well, okay, I was about 3.5, and my parents didn't go to church regularly, but the word got out that the minister, United Church minister down the street was a singer, and that he was actually going to sing in church during the service. And so they went to hear him sing, and took me along, and they brought one small bag of peanuts and gave me one at a time. But I was just taken by the whole thing, and remember it to this day. And he sang "Bless This House," and he stood in the middle of the sanctuary, like down front, but you know, he wasn't up up high, but he was there singing, just like wearing a suit and no robes or anything. And it just touched me, really touched me.
I remember here, Canon Swan, and I don't know how old I was, but I just remember they opened up the manse on Yates Street that the church used to own, and they had an afternoon tea. And I remember going with my mother and my grandmother, and I can remember to this day what I wore to that tea, but it was just, it was so welcoming. It was an extension of the church, and it was just very, very welcoming, and it stuck with me.
Archdeacon Arnold Wilkins. He was the first minister of All Saints Anglican Church in Etobicoke, and he remained at that church for 40 years, which is quite unique.
That's usually
And loved for all 40 of those years. And I was only 6 months old when we started going to that church. So as soon as I was able to know him, I knew him and his wife and children. And they were very good friends, became good friends of my parents because they were the same age. So we spent time at their cottage, and he married David and I, and he was just an absolutely lovely, lovely man. And made church fabulous.
Anyone else?
It was me, a troublemaker.
You were the past.
Surprise, surprise. That was me.
I had a teacher who was a lay reader who went on to become an Anglican priest. But the minister who was, I'll say the ordained one, was Reverend Oakes, and I kind of got in trouble with him because he's the one I put lipstick on in the front too. I figured then that I didn't know that I didn't need glasses. So after that, I was sure God was watching. So watch out, God.
For me, it was my, when I was very young, my parents didn't go to church, but my grandmother and my aunt did, so whenever I went to visit them, which they were close then, because that was often, I went to church with them. They went to a Catholic church. So it was a Catholic priest that was at their church who I developed a very close relationship with. And then after he was no longer the priest of that church, I kept a relationship with him. So all my questions, which my mom couldn't handle about why are we here, who's God, what happens with this, and what does this mean, she would say, "Oh, James, can you come over for tea?" James, can you really come again and play cards with you?
What a good mother, though.
I know.
A good mother.
Yeah.
Or can we all come over to like grandma's and Father James come over for dinner? Julia's got questions again. So it was great. That's great. We had crystal hands. And I just thought that was because it had something to do with his magic. As a priest, you must be magic.
Chuck?
This is a story of a priest I never knew, but his name was always etched in history because his name was on the baptistry. His name was Canon A.H. Walker, before my time. So one time I was at the Seisman, and this old elderly man came in, and I wasn't young either, but he was carrying I think he had an oxygen tank, and he was quite aged, and I recognized him because I knew him from an association in Falls, and his name was John Walker, and he told me, well, that was his father, and so I tried to think quickly, who would not remember him, and then there's a lady in our church, Emma McFadden, who was a dear to me, because she looked after me once, and she just died a couple years ago at the age of 103. And I said, Emma, no. So I said to him, I said, here's a lady that will know you, come on over. So he got over there. And I said, Emma, do you recognize her? She goes, oh, it's Johnny. Not John. And here she knew him as a kid. I made that connection because Ken Walker's name was on the baptistry every time you walked through the back of the church.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I don't know what his current title is, but I always know him as Reverend Snelling. He's Archdeacon Reverend Bob Snelling.
Where from?
From Grace.
Going once? Twice? Only because we got a lot to get through. All right. If you do want to jump in with a name or a short story as we're working through the rest of tonight's material, please feel free. We'll move on to a short reading here. So this is a short excerpt from the Reverend Dr. Atkinson in 1840. The measure of your piety is to be taken then, not so much by the devotions of the Sabbath as by the doings of the week, not by what you seem to be at church, by what you really are at home. It is into the relative and social character that the gospel is to strike its influence. O let your conversation then, beloved brethren, be as it becometh the gospel of Christ. Walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called. So, last week, we finished up with a brand new church having opened up. So, some really good news. And then the really awful news that 9 days after the church was opened up, their rector, Reverend James Clark, died in a terrible, or as the result of a terrible accident. So, at that time, the Diocese of Toronto had been newly formed, and so there was a new bishop who was then local to this area, which was a lot closer than the previous bishop. Does anybody remember where that bishop was? In Quebec, that's right. And who never paid visits out here and didn't seem to care too much or mind too much what happened. So here was bishop of some notoriety, John Strawn. So the local parish here, after the death of Reverend James Clark, had got together and written a letter to the bishop. So in a letter, the wardens, the process, now remember that in the history of this place, there was some very Presbyterian influence. So the fact that the parish council and the wardens, they called together essentially a parish meeting and they talked about it, and they decided, yeah, we know who we want. And so they wrote a letter and they told the bishop. Well, in those days, that's not how it worked. And the Presbyterian Church and Methodist Church and in the Reformed tradition, you would call a pastor, but very much in the Anglican Church in those days, the bishop would send you a priest. Now, it wouldn't be done without consultation, but you certainly did not tell the bishop who you thought the bishop should send. So that's exactly what they did. So the bishop, in his letter, in regard to filling up the vacancy, it will require much consideration. St. Catharines is now a station of great importance, and with the character of attainment of the congregation, a clergyman in every respect qualified may not be immediately attainable. So this also represents a bit of a change because, again, that previous bishop, having all the way from Quebec, not paid very much attention to this place because it was a bit of a backwater outpost. But now, this was seen as a church with some status and growing, and that it was attracting, what's the wording again? It was becoming a station of great importance, and with the character of attainment of the congregation. So essentially they were starting to, I think we covered last week, there was however many judges and magistrates, and it was starting to become very much a society parish, if you will. So a big change in a dozen years. So in this letter that the parish sent as well, they also they gave a timeline. They not only said who they wanted, they said, well, we'll try and out for 5 years. And they wanted funding. So they wanted funding not only from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, but they also wanted funding, probably from the diocese and from the government. So Bishop Strawn also responded to that, and he was quite specific. I don't think it's said here, so let me just borrow into the book. He says to them, he started off his letter, "Gentlemen, I have the honor to acknowledge your letter, dated the 26th, enclosing certain proceedings of the meeting of the congregation of St. George's Church. It is not customary to receive applications from congregations which, in a manner, go to the selection of a clergyman already settled in another parish." That was the other thing, is the priest they had chosen was in a parish near, sorry, where was he? He was near Kingston, in Bath. So it is, however, to be understood that the aid in support of their clergyman given by the congregation is to be during his incumbency, not for a short period of years. This is a condition which the poverty of the church and the want of funds from any other source compel me to make, for the allowance either of the government or the Society for the Propagation in Foreign Parts is too small to support a respectable clergyman in any part of the province without other assistance, much less a place rising into such prosperity, intelligence, and gentility as that of St. Catharines. I cannot therefore doubt that the congregation will readily change in their resolution the words 5 years to during his incumbency. So pretty kind of iron fist and a velvet glove suggestions there. So even with all of that posturing, he does take their suggestion. And so that particular clergyman, Reverend Abraham Fuller Atkinson, is transferred from Bath near Kingston, and he comes here to St. Catharines. So And it's noted that his coming represents one of the most expansive and creative periods in St. George's history. So he was born in Ireland in 1803. He moved to Canada at the age of 24. And he was actually ordained in Quebec. So in Quebec, he married Anne Ansley in 1831. And they had 7 children, 5 of whom were born here in St. Catharines. And he was 37 when they moved here to St. Catharines. So when he arrived, there was still no parsonage that had been built. So a house was rented for them until a rectory was finally purchased 15 years later. Now his stipend, his remuneration was £100 a year to supplement what the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was giving him. So this was the first time that the congregation, St. George's, took responsibility for paying its clergy in any measure. Before that, they'd all been essentially missionaries, paid for by missionary societies. And so the subscription list of 27 names actually pledged to pay £101. So I see your 100 and I raise you one. I mean, it's a good sort of political move, especially given what the bishop had written to them in their letters. Now, in his work, he was known for having been an extraordinarily good preacher. And so if that taste at the beginning was any indication, apparently he preached like that all the time. And he got right to work when he arrived. So finishing off the building and furnishing details for the new church building. So rather than the weekly collection thing that we do, they set out right away to get renting those pews. So that the center pews were the more expensive. The sides and the galleries were of lesser rent. And also during that time, the Reverend George Mortimer Armstrong came, and he began in 1840, and he was the first in a long line of assistant ministers at St. George's. And assistants often filled in for Atkinson, whose health tended to be poor. Interestingly, the salary of the curates was the responsibility of the rector at that time. So.
It's the 101.
Possibly. So during that time period as well, just in the area, there was, of course, a lot of growth. So the Welland Canal was being enlarged. Louis Chicluna's boat building enterprise made St. Catharines the major shipbuilding center of Upper Canada. And so locally, by 1852, there were 6 flour mills, a woolen factory, machine shops, axe and edge tool factory, 4 marble factories, a brewery, 2 distilleries, a tannery, a horticultural nursery, 3 banks, 2 newspapers, and a telegraph office. And then, in 1853, the railway came to town. So the GWR made its way to St. Catharines, at which time there were also gas streetlights were installed. So, quite a busy period in many, many different ways. So, what kind of leadership skills do you think the Reverend Atkinson and the parish leaders might have needed at this time in St. George's history?
There must have been Sunday school at that time.
I don't think Sunday school as we know it had been established, but I mean in terms of Christian education, there would have been something.
You know what strikes me is everybody remembering an important priest whom they had a fondness or remembrance that way. So I just wonder if this guy was like a charismatic. He was right to the gospel and to your heart in terms of that little snippet of a sermon. I don't know. I mean, I just want to imagine that he's warm and friendly and inviting to, okay, yeah. You know him?
I knew him personally. No, he was the most loved
Yes.
minister
Yeah.
of this place.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
he
that's-
was wonderful. In fact, the window above the altar was put there in his honor.
Yeah.
And the one in the lake used to be up there.
Yes.
Mhm.
And the chair by the side transept door, the big chair with the, points, that was made for him because he was a very big man. But they loved him. They absolutely adored him. So he must have been wonderful.
You would think with the growth and everything going on, though, he would have also had to been very sort of long-term thinking. Like he couldn't just be focused to the moment. He had to be thinking beyond, like where was this all going to go? And I mean, with the pews and raising the rents for the special pews and all of that, that sort of had to be part of a longer-term plan.
And you're having somewhat adaptable to things changing, like.
Exactly. Yeah, and he had to lead the change, which is not easy.
Yeah.
I think you would have to be a chartered accountant too.
Well,
you have to deal with finances, so you have to have some kind of understanding.
sense.
But given the growing size of the parish, but also the growing community, the fact that it was, essentially a church of the establishment, I mean, an important element of leadership is also recruiting people and then delegating to, and so essentially decentralizing. So, I mean, yes, he's the priest and pastor, but for him to effectively do that, he can't do everything himself. So, whereas he would have had to have had an understanding of, but finding somebody who could take proper care of the accounts.
And in the book it mentions that he was very good at delegating and making sure everything was taken care of, not by him all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, he was a foremost
But
leader.
you would have to know where the money is being spent on, wisely. Couldn't just let someone willy-nilly spend it, that's what I mean. You would have to know where the dollars and cents are going, and I feel that some things have not changed. Back then, you'd have to know, the priest today would have to know, how even though someone else is doing, I'm getting myself into trouble here, just.
No. I mean, yes, of course, but in a like not in a micromanaging sort of way, which is a trap that a lot of clergy, especially in smaller parishes, fall into. And so having the right people in the right positions, so being able to delegate and trust. And so of course, knowing that the money was being spent on the various things. I mean, of course they would have known that, but then in terms of sharing the information, so would have the wardens and the other people in positions of leadership. So, but again, him not having to do it all himself, but delegating appropriately. So, I mean, so there's a couple of notes in the chapter. So the Canadian Biographical Publication gave this assessment of him, that he was one of the most eloquent preachers of his day, gifted with a voice of great compass and sweetness, which made him prominent as a reader of pathos, fervency, and dramatic power. So your assessment of him as being charismatic, like not necessarily charismatic movement kind of way, but being a charismatic personality, he would attract people that would want to help grow the place. And so with all the growth and everything happening in the community, it could help attract more people that want to help build the place up. So people with particular skills and vision to assist with that long-term view of the church and what it could do for the community.
What a challenge, though. I mean, his health was such a challenge for such a long time, and the assistant curates were taking so much of the responsibility, and yet, to your point, Liz, he was so beloved and everything that was done for him that it must have been a very, very strong personality that caught on very early in his time here.
I'll slip you your payment later because that's perfect segue into there's a
You can
quote.
pay me later.
There's a quote from a newspaper columnist who wrote with a pseudonym. Wrote in 1855, Atkinson is one of the most talented, pious, and popular preachers of the day. Although a person of feeble health, yet by his indefatigable labors for many years, he had gathered together a large flock and built up a society in which he is greatly endeared, and by which he is held in high estimation. And a quote from Catherine Merritt's diary. Mr. Atkinson's text, I reckon that the sufferings of this present day, referring to a text from Romans, the whole chapter is beautiful, and Mr. Atkinson gave a most expressive exposition of the verse quoted above, so true, so affectionately from the heart, and the passage of Scripture brought in most appropriately and convincing. So he was able to speak to, in more ways than one, the likes of the Merritt family, as well as all of the other people of lesser means than the Merritts and such. Us normal folks.
Scott, I guess he would also be been here in a period of great growth, and also at the Anglican Church was a great power.
A growing influence. Again, having reflecting on where they were just 12 years before, they were much more of a congregational community church almost, but a lot had changed in 12 years, and that was probably happening all over the place. So especially as after the British became, the dominant influence over the French, and as they were able to expand outside of Quebec, and the Roman Catholics kind of had the, if you will, the seat of their power was in Quebec, and then the Anglican Church started to spread in other places, and grew up with the government in a way. So different than the system in the UK, but still very much having the history of that relationship in the UK. So, maybe not the authority, but definitely growing in authority at that time as society and culture grew as well, or Western society and culture grew. Any other thoughts on leadership skills? Does anything strike you as being similar today from that time in our history?
Well, you're more for those extreme eloquent, charismatic.
Very nice of you to say.
And Wendy's willing to share for you.
I was just so struck with that little snippet of his sermon.
Yeah.
That sounded like it could have been spoken last week.
Yes.
Like it very much bringing the gospel to us and how we should be living our lives.
Yeah.
So it's the same now. Like what's spoken has to, for me, I have to be able to take it and walk with it. And it just strikes me that was the way he approached things, and it's the way that I experience it now.
And so to ask a question and draw a bit more out there, was it hard to understand, even in that slightly older form of English?
Not at all.
Right? So
Not at all.
It's
Yeah.
straightforward.
clear,
Yeah.
concise, easily understood, almost to the point of being piercing, right? Pretty direct, but not harsh.
Yeah.
Just and the same as it was then, it is today, as it was, when Jesus was preaching. So it picks up on the timeless aspects of the gospel, right? So one would say, like, that kind of preaching is very heavily heavily rooted in or heavily invested in Scripture and in the teachings from Scripture. So, and that's precisely, speaks truth at any time. So, yeah, very similar. I'm not sure if our tonight is good job as him, but definitely what we need to do. So.
I was thinking
And Michael.
too along this whole thing that he was going home to 7 children going round and round, running around the house. His wife
Hard
must have
enough
been.
time with one.
That was what I was thinking, because I never did my ministry when I had little children, you know, and I just can't even imagine it. And you and Martha are both doing that.
Yeah.
And that's
No,
really
seven.
impressive.
And like ill
And
health.
you try to
I mean, that's-
imagine you're in ill health and you get 7 of them running around.
And so, I mean, they must have worked together as a team really, really well to overcome his health issues and to raise 7 kids.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, he and his wife.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
and we gotta have dinner on the table every night. It's not like you can just go out and grab something, you
Yeah.
know.
But it also seems here like the preaching and the gospel and that kind of thing. But there's also, it seems here, is running the church as a building. I don't want to use the word corporation because I'm sure back there they didn't. But it seems as if we're doing the same kind of thing now, designating, having people volunteer and all of this. So that hasn't changed either.
It's amazing.
You know, it's amazing. 20-something years, we're still doing the same thing. Either we're doing it well or we're slow learners or something.
I think too, people are attracted to the culture that is built.
Yeah.
And, you know, it wouldn't, how do you say it? Not all styles of leadership and how you engage people is attractive to all people.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's a little bit easier maybe when it's the only gig in town. But I think it's the same today. Like, people were attracted, he was, you know, well loved by the congregation. And when you have that relationship, you can, it seems like you do more because you're working together and you're not always like that.
Yeah.
The rest of it is supported in many ways with our parish too, because he certainly wouldn't be making a salary with 7 children.
I think the biggest change might have been that our priests today were more approachable. And you look at the pictures out there.
But portraiture was seen in a different way.
So they
right?
also,
I mean,
you don't know what the people look like.
No, but they seem to be
They look very stern.
No, I just go, that would be my experience generally. I think that, you know, it's just a different era. Like when I grew up, I mean, priests about it, like they were holy and held hands with God in my child's image of this person. And that I'd never want to be like the preacher's child, you have to be good all the time. And I wouldn't want to be a doctor's child because I couldn't fake sick. You know, like that was my, you know, like, that's how I do things. But I know like there was a distancing that I felt and experienced, except for my padre. That's why I loved him so dearly. But
I was going to say, Father James wasn't like that.
yeah, so I generally think that that's different in this day and age, that there's a friendship that develops amongst congregants and
Don't you think that was?
I don't know. I
But I
don't know.
think-
You can revere and have good and warm feelings about somebody and not be their friend or, I don't know.
It was their
I don't know. It's a
station.
different
I was
era.
gonna
Yeah.
say, it wasn't a Hughes sort of set the stations.
Well,
in some ways.
And knowing that they're human beings, just like you are, you know, it's like a, almost like a mystical calling. And it wasn't until I lived in Cochrane, and it was a really small town, so, you know, it was easy to be friends with everyone, that I was friends with our clergy and had a different relationship, and up until then, it was clergy and parishioner. But because it was such a small town, everybody was the same and at the same level.
And I think that's very much a perception thing. And so also, I mean, going back to the thing of leadership, I mean, I think it depends on the person as well as the situation. And so what I imagine, because I think to a certain degree, that more classical expectation of a clergy person would have been there. But I mean, to really grow the parish and in kind of a boom time, to be able to connect with the people, to have him as well loved as history. I mean, granted it's history, and history doesn't, as it's written, it doesn't include everything, but for history to be written in this way, to claim that he was as well loved as he was, like, he couldn't have been that aloof. Like, he must have been
Approachable.
yeah. Because if he had been aloof, like, it would have been much more, you wouldn't see things written in the way of how much they loved him.
Yeah.
It would have been written more in the,
Admiration.
how much they respect him, what a noble
Yeah.
person he was, or, more what a great leader he was, and like, you really get that sense of the relationship, which is not there with somebody who is at arm's length and up on a pedestal. So,
What about the congregation though? I mean, if you're paying a certain amount for a pew because you can, you're a merit, and then someone else is looking for a free pew or paying less, I mean, what sense does that create in the congregation? I mean, I know we all have our favorite places to sit in church, right? But I don't think we necessarily look at them as, from a status standpoint, there's usually some kind of story behind it.
and there is, but remember that I mean, that would have been the norm, right? So it would have been an expectation built into the social cultural fabric of living, immigrant culture at the time, especially having come from, for the church, having come from the UK. And because I mean, it was very heavily, like the United Empire loyalists who came north, very heavily influenced with culture from Britain. And so classism, the socioeconomic differences, like that was all built in. So I think it would have been but a mark of leadership for him to be able to transcend all that and to be able to minister appropriately to those of lesser means as to the ministers, right? And everyone in between. So a bit of almost more of a testament to his ministry that he would have been able to do that and have been loved by all of them.
That was probably why he was loved by so many.
Yeah.
You wonder though, because later on it talks about that it was a fairly elitist congregation, because later on, I mean, new people or the poor couldn't even come to church because they didn't have places to. So I mean, he dealt with the hierarchy of the community at that point in time.
Yeah. And that wouldn't have been so as this became more and more the society parish, right? And then they would have needed more and more space for people to rent pews, so it did edge people out. And I can't imagine that would have, that wouldn't have all been of his doing and choosing necessarily, but does it make him complicit in it? Well, sure, he's the rector of the parish, but you imagine that there's other power dynamics at work there. And again, related to social cultural norms of the day and other challenges. So,
were they box pews or just pews like we have today?
that I don't know.
I mean, are there any old pictures of St. George? Because I mean,
I just think
The doors.
the doors,
Yeah.
The wall, the
wainscoting.
the wainscoting on the walls, side walls, those are the pew doors.
Those are the pew doors.
okay.
Yeah, and they were just on the ends of
Yeah.
Because we saw, I mean, we did it a few in England.
Yeah.
you could actually sleep in there, no? In the pulpit, you could wound up, so he could at least think he could see.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on. So they came to the new tower and a new spire. So minutes of meetings from that time in around 1842 begin to mention lack of space for worship and services. So there was this significant request from Nehemiah Merritt, wealthy brother of Thomas Merritt, who left 500 pounds to the church for a tower and spire to be added to the front of the church, plus 12 free pews to be added. So an interesting idea there. So the church spire became the tallest, made the church the tallest building in the community to accomplish what church spires were supposed to be, which was a sign and symbol to people who were traveling, so that they could easily find the church and the center of town. And so the lifting the bells up that high, so that the call to prayer could be heard all throughout the community. So, and it says that Atkinson set about fulfilling the requests of Nehemiah Merritt with a dispatch and careful attention to every detail. So they chose a particular architect from Upper Canada College, John G. Howard, and then John Kent, who was the assistant to Howard, made several visits to St. Catharines from Toronto, and then they were the ones who ultimately designed. And the new tower was, they laid the cornerstone in 1844. They used Kingston limestone. And it was finished, and the tower was erected, and pews dedicated and set apart in 1845. So, pass the book around if you are, or if you have a book, page 84, just a picture of did anybody want to see the picture of the parish? So just after the tower was built. So after that addition to the building, then they ordered a new bell, which was ordered and then hung in 1847. And it required a loan to get that bell. So here they used up all of their bequested money from Mr. Merritt. But that is a bell that still rings today. 1,200 pounds. I don't think that's the cost of the bell. I think that's how much it weighs. So, yeah. 1,200 pounds for a bell would have been a lot. Considering that they were able to add the bell tower and the steeple and 12 pews with that request of 500 pounds. And then in 1847, they had their first bazaar, which weighs 361 pounds and allowed for the purchase of an organ. So if you think up until this time, they might not have had a proper pipe organ. I can't remember if I'd seen that they did have an organ, but it would have been a pump or just a small thing. Quick side story. I did an internship in summer of 2002 in a place called Barkerville, which is in the middle of British Columbia, and got to pretend to be the priest who built that parish. 1867, it was a gold rush town, and as part of the gold rush in BC, there was camels and all kinds of outlandish and exciting things. Well, they had paid for somebody to bring over a pump organ from Britain, and then it was hauled up into the mountains on the back of a camel. And it's still there today. So if you ever go, actually see this thing. It's a miracle. Anyway, so I mean, organs were a big deal in those days. They were not necessarily easy to get, even with our proximity to Toronto. So in this time, you know, some of the biggest and most beloved symbols of the church came to be a part of the life of this parish. So the spire, the bells, and the organ. So for yourself, what are the symbols of the church? What are those things that when you think of them, you know, sort of make you think, church?
The stained glass windows always
Glass
me. Our church didn't have, had electronic bells, I think that's accurate in Grace Church, and we never heard them, as I can remember anyway. But the windows were always very significant.
Yeah.
We just spent 4 weeks being told church has nothing to do with the building.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is quite true, right? And then there's the investment that people put into it, and so they become symbols. So it's a very hard thing for us to escape.
The church that I'm serving right now in Niagara Falls it's only 85 years old, but it's a stone edifice and stained glass and the whole thing. And the bishop apparently, or the assistant bishop, came a year or two ago and said the usual thing that we've ministers heard this all our life, and the church is not a building, the church is not a building. And he, of course, said this to them, and they haven't recovered from it since. They just can't. They know that the church isn't the building, the church is the people, but the building is so precious to them because of the history that it has. And here, this one with 225 years, you know, and all this, the building is a symbol of the house of God. If nothing else, yeah.
I mean, I want to come back to Julia's point, though, and first ask if you
Yeah.
had anything else to say on that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. One sec, John. One sec. Go back. Did you have anything else to say on that?
No, I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
We've been thinking of it as the
No,
church is
okay.
a church without
Yeah.
these physical items, so it's just funny that now we're being asked, which of these physical items?
Right?
So it's like, oh, well, I kind of removed my thinking of it, and now you're offering my thinking back to this, because church is, yeah,
But
the
it's
people
both.
and the community.
But it is
So-
both, you know, and if you use that noun or like the, okay, it's both.
So if I can,
And I hear you loud and clear, and that's my.
Oh, I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
I'm a philosophical person, so when I'm doing this, I'm not arguing, I just love the conversation.
Yeah.
But I
So-
like what you said, it's the symbol of. So whether it's church is not the building, it's the community. So the bells and the organ are the symbols of, and those can be anywhere, and that's what's so great, right?
And continuing with the sort of philosophic idea, are there any other symbols that you can think of, symbols of the church that are not building, that are not specific to the building?
As far as I'm concerned, to me, the processional cross is a very important thing in terms of it moves around us, it tells us what's going on. And a number of years back at the cathedral, they had a service where they invited all the parishes to come and bring their processional cross with them. And it was fascinating to see the different interpretations that we used on that particular thing. But to me, that really means the message is Jesus is amongst us all. He's walking through us, pay attention. And particularly when you're reading the Gospel, for example, it really focuses the point.
So let me, thinking of the processional cross then, the processional cross comes in, starts the service, everybody stands up. But what's different, and the processional, everybody stands up and the processional cross leads everybody out. But what's different about the gospel procession and the processional cross? As opposed to the procession and the recession. So the entrance and the exit. It stops in the middle, and what happens? Everybody turns towards, but turns towards what? It's not the cross, it's the gospel. It's the gospel. So in terms of just trying to poke and prod, getting you to think of those symbols that aren't so much the building. And the processional cross is a good one because it walks and it moves, but even more is the gospel. The gospel preached from the midst of the people. And that is a sign and a symbol. And the bread and the wine, those are symbols that don't need a building. So just to put those alongside, the bells and the organ and the stained glass, which are also important parts of our tradition. And then, just because we're really running out of time, but the three-legged stool of Anglicanism, which is scripture, reason, and tradition. So thinking of the various signs and symbols in that kind of thinking. Yeah.
The anointing, like the oil.
Yeah, holy oil. I mean, the sacraments. Yeah. The sacraments, by their very nature, are a sign and symbol of the church and of our ministry.
That's the one thing I miss at St. George's compared to when I was at Grace. We get Bibles in the pew. When I came in early, I read, and quite often, notwithstanding the good readers, I always read. I want to see whether he said what was in there. But I do miss it.
There's supposed to be at least a Bible in every pew, and they move.
I haven't seen one.
I haven't seen it.
Because I like to read it when they're reading it.
Would you bring your own?
No, I don't, because I leave it here and lose it, so I get.
It's not being wrong.
So take us back and forth.
You bring one then.
We have a page and a half to get through. Put us in the high gear here. So the wider Anglican Church. So synods. So prior to the year 1850, the bishops had been appointed by the British Crown. Who's the head of the British Crown? Right. So
well, that time the king.
That's right. So sorry, I said the head of the crown, but the head of the church. The head of the church is the crown.
The head of the monarch.
So that's why the monarch is the one who appoints the bishops. And new dioceses were likewise created by the crown. So prior to that, there was no legal means for anyone other than the bishop and the crown to participate in the organization and well-being of the church. So that was still very much, the Church of England in Canada, except we weren't even Canada, so the Church of England in Upper Canada at that time, right? There was no Anglican Church of Canada yet. This was the C of E. So Bishop Strachan in Toronto looked at the United States and the Episcopal Church, which had meetings of conventions or synods made up of clergy and elected representatives from every congregation. And he wanted something similar here. So Strachan was seen as establishment mentality with Upper Canadian society controlled by the family compact. However, he wanted this more democratic process for the church. St. George's rector, curate, and 2 lay representatives went to Toronto for its first synod meeting called by Bishop Strachan in 1853. So as other dioceses were founded across the country, they took that same synodical system, including Niagara, which was created in 1875. So, clergy stipends. Congregations had to provide housing for their clergy, but stipends continued to be provided by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and by clergy reserves, which were established in 1791 and then disbanded in 1854. Voluntarism, regular offerings of parishioners became the primary means of supporting the church and clergy, as opposed to those pew rentals and other outside sources of income, like getting income from the government or income from the SPG or other missionary agencies. So, as St. George's continued to grow through this period, they were still in the system of using pew ownership. So it meant that it was difficult to accommodate new people and also those who could not afford to rent or purchase pews. So it became a bigger and bigger problem. So as Chuck had noted earlier, the poor were essentially being edged out of the institution, which should have been ministering to them. So in 1862, there was a church meeting at which it was decided that they needed to do something to address this problem. So in 1864, we saw the next expansion of St. George's was with the addition of the side transepts, which also, in a way, changed the shape, the physical shape of the structure to give it more of a cruciform shape, which is a very old and ancient shape of churches, to literally take the shape of a cross. So this drastically changed the interior of the building to what we are more familiar with today. And they also moved to have evening services at which all of the pews were free. So the morning services, the paying congregants would come and get to sit in their pews.
So they got the French minister.
In the evening services, you get the warm minister. We're preaching that same sermon all day. Then anybody could sit anywhere. So.
That's when you made those mistakes by the evening. You had to do it perfectly. Guys didn't have to get up and say, I want to go to the evening. All right.
Also probably, even though Sunday was supposed to be the Sabbath, it also probably would have given opportunity to those who were forced to work because they couldn't afford to pay for pews in the morning anyway. It would also have given them an opportunity to go to church that they might not have otherwise had the opportunity to go to. So pew ownership remained in effect here at St. George's until 1921. Pretty late.
It existed in England up until World War II.
Yeah.
In many, many churches in England, it existed in World War II, pew ownership.
And if you go to certain parishes, so if you would go to Andrew Aswell's church in Toronto, there's still gates on some of the pews, or there were a number of years ago, early 2000s when it was there last, I have to admit. But so it's interesting when you go into those places, you still have to open up the doors to get in. Kids love to play with it. Slam in the middle of the service. Following up on the parsonage, land had been set aside in 1828 and never came to fruition as anything as a completed rectory. So finally, in 1852, the vestry voted, which was all men at that point, voted on putting the women in charge of raising the funds for a rectory. So obviously they recognized they couldn't do it, so they needed to call in, Exactly. They held another bazaar, and the rectory was purchased on King Street.
We're so good. We're sorry nowadays.
Yeah.
Ross, as a side thing to that, the women at the church here raised the first bazaar, and money went to the building of the general hospital.
From the first bazaar,
bazaar,
£361.
No, this was separate. This was a bazaar that the church had, and the proceeds went to the funding of the first general hospital on Queen Street.
Right. All right.
There were powerhouse, those like this sometimes.
Well, the patrons of the early church were, of course, women. People who supported the early church, like post Jesus' death. People who helped facilitate those the early house church networks were, by and large, women.
Wealthy women.
Yeah. So stewardship, in so many different ways, continues to be important. So anybody care to elaborate as to why stewardship is important to church congregations?
You gotta finance them.
You're buying into it too. If you put money into something, then you care about it.
Yep.
So then you're involved.
So expanding though, because all too often we think of stewardship as just funds, but it's not just
Time and
funds,
talent.
right? I mean, as we try to say, it's time, talent, and treasure. Because without people investing, I mean, yes, people tend to care more about something when they've invested funds into it, but you know, people also tend to care about stuff when they invest blood, sweat, and tears. So there's that aspect, but it is about that investment. So how would church life be changed, possibly even diminished, if the church relied solely or on outside support for its ministry?
Ownership and responsibility.
Ownership and
Would be
responsibility.
lost.
Yeah.
It wouldn't exist without that helpful stewardship, volunteers, people that cleaning the church or decorating
So,
or caring for each other.
and
It's more than the money aspect of it. It's
well, and the
whole-
building aspect. I mean, let's be honest. As much as we love our buildings, they suck up a lot of time. But our ministry is not to a building. Our ministry is to a people. So to come back to the point that Julia was making earlier, you know, in the thinking that the church is the people. The church is the people of God. And so the ministry is to the people of God and not to a building. You know, we have a building to take care of so that we have a place to do ministry in. But, you know, this is the church. This is a building. So important signs, symbols, and recognition, because blood, sweat, and tears goes into this as well. But there's more blood, sweat, and tears in this than there is in this. I mean, it's where we are, how we live. We don't have one without the other, but it is an important distinction to make. And so the other aspect of it, and I think this is something that we, not just we at St. George's, but we as a church writ large are wrestling with now, is, you know, that idea in terms of stewardship and ministry. You know, we've slipped into this strange place of over-professionalizing ministry, and so there's some things that I think perhaps we've lost. And that the history, you know, those people who dared to write to Bishop Strawn and say, we want that guy. And why did they want that guy? Because somebody had heard of him and knew of him and said, have you heard this guy preach? So they knew in listening to him to make those connections, and like, you know, they knew that that's the guy that they wanted because of the community that they were. Otherwise, they would have been just happy to get whoever, either the SPG sent to them or the bishop decided that they would get. But there was, because of that, because of the life that they had together, and a certain commitment and stewardship of time and talent given to the community, they had an understanding of a life together as the church. So, sorry, again, rushing through over time, but there are things that we lose when we say, oh, this is the minister, this is the person who's going to do the ministry, and I'll just sit here and be ministered to. There's not much stewardship in that. There's not a lot of investment into that relationship. I'm really hoping that she's going to invest a lot into me, but I'm just going to sit here. And this is a very real issue that the church is wrestling with. It's also not a new one. Through various stages of life that the church has gone through here and in the UK, other places, It's a cyclical sort of thing, but it is a very real aspect. And so why we talk about stewardship and why stewardship is so important. Because it is an investment in a community, a living community.
So, could you say that the stewardship is the investment that I have in the people that surround me?
Yeah, 100%.
That's really the stewardship of the church, not you as a person.
Not solely,
Not
right?
solely as
So,
this, but it's all of this with each other.
but part of my job, part of my job is to make sure that you're equipped to be able to make that investment. And so if I'm not equipping you, I'm not doing my job, right? And if I'm somehow worried about my position, my ministry, and I don't want anybody else to take it over, I'm not doing my job properly. I mean, in a sense, my job is to work myself out of a job to know that you all will care for yourself. There's a very controversial statement made by somebody, I think from the U.S., who said, you know who the church is, really, and you know what the church is when your building burns down, when your pastor leaves town, and all you're left with is the people. Then you know what the church is. So, also, during this time, there were the steps toward Confederation. There was the new cemetery created on Queenston Street, taking place of the old one that was here. And there was also, as we know, just the plaque and memorial over on Geneva Street. The Underground Railroad was operating right in our very neighborhood, trying to help save lives. And life cycles, there was the death of many of the family members in the town at that time. So, also at that time, the Reverend Atkinson became the Reverend Dr. Atkinson. He received a doctorate in canon law, and then he resigned in 1864 and unfortunately died 2 years later. So he was buried here in St. Catharines, and the newspaper noted, "We never remember being present at a funeral where deeper or more heartfelt grief appeared to be shown by the whole assembly." So all of the businesses in town were closed for the funeral, and the Good Shepherd's stained glass window was installed to commemorate the Reverend Dr. Atkinson. And it was the first stained glass window. It was eventually taken out when the new chancel was added on, and was given to the new Christ Church in town. However, it did eventually find its way back to St. George's. So, I will leave you with that opening quote, and to think about and reflect on how the Reverend Dr. Atkinson lived out his own words in his ministry and life.
Thank you.
Thank you. Martha will be back to fearlessly lead us next week, and thank you all very much.
You got all the way to the end.
Only 5 minutes over. Good, thank you.